Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, and I will turn it over to Noah, and we're ready for that panel discussion.
Fantastic. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noah Geisel. I am the Microcredential Program Manager at University of Colorado Boulder, and it is a huge honor for me to be able to moderate this panel with three really smart individuals who are leading just some really impressive and awesome work throughout our state. And hopefully this will be a great opportunity for us to learn and share. Please know that while we have planned out some questions and some thoughts around what we might want to address on this landscape analysis, you are please take us up on the invitation to drop into the chat any questions that you have, and we will make sure to get on that for you. And I think I'm trying to figure out right now if you're able to actually drop it in the chat on the Zoom or if it's on the hub and CVent for us, but I'll definitely be monitoring that and making sure that the panelists have a chance to respond to your questions specific to your own learning needs. Jumping in with the panelists, we kind of thought rather than reading their bios to you, assuming everybody already knows how to read and can see those on the website. So thought a fun way to have them introduce themselves would more to do a quick round robin, Bianca, Mike, and then Eric, sharing your name, your institution, your title, and what is your why for dedicating your energy to this space? We'll start with you, Bianca.
Thanks, Noah. Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca Kumar. I am the Continuing Education Specialist in the Office of the Registrar at University of Denver. So for me, continuing education and professional development opportunities are critically important and beneficial for lifelong learners, professionals seeking to expand or maintain their knowledge base and creating connections within the community. So that's why I'm within this space.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Noah. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So my name is Mike Macklin. I'm an Associate Vice Chancellor with the Colorado Community College System. Portfolio includes academic affairs and workforce development. And I think that has a lot to do with my why in this space of how do we better connect skills and competencies with what we have traditionally seen in formal education and recognize what individuals know, though they may not have sat in a classroom to receive that knowledge. So I've dedicated a lot of time and effort in this space and look forward to the conversation.
Hey, everybody. My name is Eric Dunker. I serve as the Associate Vice President and Dean for Business, Technology, and Workforce Partnerships for Arapahoe Community College. And a big why in this space for me is we've been launching a lot of new apprenticeships in the healthcare space, in the technology space, in water utilities, in property management. And when you're really incorporating work-based learning, that skills-based credentialing, as opposed to waiting for the end of the semester or waiting till you get their degree to understand what skills and competencies an apprentice or a student can bring to the workplace, our employees want to know week by week. And they're able to then do things on the job as they progress through the related instruction. And so microcredentialing is huge in this space. So I've been working with Noah in his previous role and collaborating with him and work a lot with Mike on and trying to infuse microcredentialing in order to create signals between the apprentice, the employer, and the education provider.
Well, I loved how you put that, and I have a great feeling that we're probably going to be coming back to what you just said there, Eric, but I am going to stick with you real quick, just as the person with the longest job title. We'll have you go first on the next one. But, in thinking about just the kind of brief overview of just what work, you all are engaged in, where you are in the work, I feel like you gave us a brief overview already, Eric, to kind of let people dip their toes in the water. And so maybe for you, what it would be the newspaper headline 5 years from now that about the work that's going on at Arapahoe Community College with apprenticeships and credentialing that you hope people get to read?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that your workplace experience and your academic experience are synced up, and that the and the credentialing piece it's talking to each other. So there's more frequent milestones that are co-created, whether it's through learning on the job or learning in the classroom, or a combination of both. So this is scary for some educators, but yes, employers and industry associations and educators co-creating, essentially parallel delivery models, in which essentially what we did, I can get into it later, for our medical assistant apprenticeship, we took an 18-month classroom-based program where you wait till you get done with 18 months of classroom instruction, then get your credential. We started them, reverse engineered everything, so they work day one in a clinic as unlicensed, and then what can they do until they work up to that license, and then we infused that the related instruction. We worked with Centura closely to develop the on-the-job training, and then we narrowed that down. They started passing their national certification within 6 months. We've served over 100 apprentices now, and it was through that that sort of badging, micro-credentialing process, where once a student proves that they can create, that they can properly check patient vitals, they're doing it the next day. So having a curriculum and a degree map that speaks to the employer, speaks to the educator is critical. And if we're going to expand apprenticeships in Colorado, which I know up from the governor on down wants to do, we're going to have to create this environment at scale.
I love that the second I try and put you in a 5-year box, you share a story about how we don't need your timeline boxes when people are ready. Bianca, at DU, where you all are kind of just getting started with things, what's the kind of headline of the newspaper article, just kind of for today that would describe the work going on at DU?
Yeah, thanks, Noah. So yeah, we'll be launching our first badges hopefully this month. So I think just having Microcredentials enable students to showcase what core skills that they're capable of, and what competencies they possessed more easily to their employers than, say, a transcript from a degree program.
And Mike, we'll go over to you and kind of dealer's choice there for you, Mike, for a present day newspaper article or 5 years from now.
Yeah, so I think I'll build a little off of Eric's. I think if I was truly playing kind of the headline game, I think it's that the headline is Colorado Community College System cracks the code, and right. So I think that we've had some really great pilots. I think that we've had certain use cases for micro-credentials and badges that have gone really well, some that of course have not gone as well. And so I think for me, it's really taking all of the learning that's happened in the state and across the nation and frankly internationally, and really trying to figure out how do we systemically make it so that these are more adopted, that there's currency and portability throughout the state. And so for me, that headline, hopefully in 5 years, is CCCS cracks the code.
Wow. I love that headline. And I also love that you kind of lead with the vulnerability of things that haven't gone well. And for folks who haven't been nerds like me tracking Mike at every step of his career, Mike's, you've had the opportunity to launch, some of the first open badges really in higher ed anywhere, on up through the work that you're doing today at CCCS. And so from your point of view, when people hear about Colorado being this national leader, but haven't yet heard, tangible examples of how and why Colorado is, kind of out in front in this space, what can you share about CCCS and maybe even elsewhere that might help them go from scratching their heads to nodding along in agreement?
Yeah, man, that's a massive prompt, Noah, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about it. I think that Colorado's reputation in this space really comes from being on the leading edge of the open badge initiative movement. And I think that there was a lot of things that fell into place for us. And so, and Noah's very humble, but he also, while I was moving through some of the work at Colorado State University, he was also working very closely with Aurora Public Schools to launch the first school district-wide badge program in the state and at the time at the nation. And I think that there was a handful of those projects that were happening at the same time that we're catching quite a lot of interest from national partners, international groups that we're really trying to figure out, there's a group that's looking comprehensively from secondary to post-secondary education, trying to figure out how this works. And so at Colorado State University, I was previously with the Division of Continuing Education and was really looking at our non-credit programming to figure out how we could offer that differently. So could we unbundle credit courses and attach digital badges to those, drop the price point of those to a place where individuals could come in and find a shopping experience similar to what they would experience online. So they could go online and get a bundle of courses for a discounted price and have access to those courses immediately and move through those. Those courses still being prepared by CSU faculty or CSU subject matter experts. So really rigorous content, but trying to bridge that gap of learning can happen on YouTube, but we really should be trying to figure out how to somehow bridge that gap between formal education and then also that non-credit component. And so that was kind of the first iteration. We launched quite a few badges at CSU. Admittedly, some of those were successful and still run today. Some of those have been sunsetted and fell apart. And so I think that leads me to kind of the next piece of where CCCS was with their badge project, which was ultimately funded by a large federal grant. The TACT program that was very large in community colleges throughout the Obama administration. And this was specifically a program looking to accelerate advanced manufacturing shortages. So shortages in the talent development pipeline for advanced manufacturing. And one of the projects that they did was, they unbundled a technical math course and they put these badges on it so that an individual could take small MOOCs and go ahead and get credit for that. So really promising practices, I think, for both of these projects and for anyone who's looking in this space. The unfortunate thing about both of these projects is they were not well funded. They were not well resourced. And I think if I were to give any advice or kind of think through about, where's the hesitation and things like that, I think that really recognizing that these have to be resourced projects and they're very tough to grow on their own. But I think that if you were to look at Colorado, look at some of the successful projects across the nation, some of the failed projects across the nation, what you'll see in there is some really promising practices. So recognizing that learning doesn't just have to happen in the classroom. We need to find a way to award students some sort of recognition for that learning. And then where possible, let's have a conversation about, let's make sure that they can get that academic credit and can start working towards that post-secondary credential as they go through life, as they go through work, and really trying to accelerate the path to those different types of awards.
And Eric, I don't know if you wanted to, I was going to go to Bianca next there, but I don't know if you wanted to jump in real quick with anything as Mike talked about that unbundling word, in case that's unfamiliar to people, and some of what the work that you described earlier.
No, I mean, Mike and I work together a lot, so I want to kind of give Bianca the platform. But the only thing I would add to that is, what's something that we've co-created at ACC, and partly is through some of these grants Mike's been talking about, is blending non-credit and credit, which can make educators uncomfortable. But when they're tied to competencies, and then you can kind of tie that to a badge that's sort of validated by them, it does get them more comfortable. Because in order to do an apprenticeship, it's kind of week by week. You kind of do it in modules as opposed to semester by semester, and that's where, again, the microcredentialing and the badging helps validate our ability to blend those two areas. So I would just add that because absent of that, it does cause some tension. I'll leave it at that.
Well, and is some of what you're getting at, and tell me that I'm not willing to go there, but it almost sounds like one of the things you're going to is just this existential question of trust.
Yeah. So essentially, if you take a series of 15 courses that equal a certificate or a degree, you're ultimately going to find some competencies that are, duplicative. You're going to find some that may not be as relevant to the what industry, especially if it's a specific credential, what they're maybe looking for. Oftentimes our programs especially on the CTE, the workforce front, sort of over prepare students on the curriculum side. Whereas for entry-level positions, sometimes they're just looking for, okay, here's what I want them to know and be able to do. And that's where stacking is so important. So it's like, what we're learning to do is stack better. So instead of a 2-year MA program, create a certificate within an associate. So if they so they can get that job and then they can continue on if they need to. And that's the power of unbundling the competencies from the traditional course-based system. If that helps. That's how I look at it.
It does. I hope it does. If it
Bianca
doesn't,
has
people
much
can
better comments than I'm going to have.
Well, hopefully it does help. And if it doesn't, please do drop your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to get your questions to our awesome panelists today. And Bianca is somebody who's, in the thick of it. You mentioned you're about to launch your first badge. So you're just so much closer to like where probably a lot of our audience here today is, as far as, just jumping in here. And so, if you could just share with us just, what you're so excited about with this moment. And, feel free to kind of share just kind of what the badges are that and the credentials that DU is exploring. I'm guessing they're not vocational. And so, kind of share just what you're excited about and just what really they are. And we might have some follow-up questions from there as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Noah. And thank you, Mike and Eric. That was a great explanation about your work at CSU and Arapahoe. So DU has been steadily working on launching badges for a little over a year now. And we're mostly finally just excited to publish the badges. Internally, we've had numerous departments and faculty reach out to us over the years about microcredentials. So there's been a consistent stream of enthusiasm for them. But for us, what has drawn out the process has been largely because it's uncharted territory. So we've had to answer a lot of questions in regards to how microcredentials fit into the higher education framework. So such as in relation to hierarchy of roles within the university, policymaking and proposal processes, technical implementation, badge design, and of course, finding a badge platform to partner with. Now that we have those microcredentials finalized and publish them, I think the main lesson we've come to learn is to be very persistent in continuing the implementation process and trying to garner internal interest within the university. So while microcredentials have been around for quite a while now, it is still relatively fresh in certain spheres of higher education. So becoming an advocate for those microcredentials and further building faculty and staff interest will only benefit in the long run. The 2 badges that we will be publishing will be a coding badge and then a high education leadership badge for business.
I think that's really interesting where you went, Bianca, and hopefully we didn't just lose you. Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry.
When you talk about leadership, that kind of almost starts to get at some of what Mike was talking about, that stuff can happen, beyond the classroom walls. And so you're seeing at DU for a very different kind of student population, that looking at credentialing skills and competencies beyond classroom beyond coursework is still meeting a need.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's another one of the challenges we were experiencing at DU was deciding what kinds of courses or competencies or skills we wanted to credential. So I think that's one challenge, and we're still kind of on the fence about that. But just like Mike mentioned earlier, learning isn't reserved just for the classroom. So.
Thank you so much for that. And we do have some questions pouring in, so I'll pause on the stuff that I'm really wanting to pick your brains about, and we'll start with Brad's. And this is a long one, so but if you have your chat up, hopefully panelists you'll be able to see it. He says many of the micro-credentials are specific to a campus community and login credentials for that campus community. So I guess access. How can we create courses to offer across Colorado and or even larger audiences, outside of just Coursera and edX? He's specifically curious about the scalability of inclusive design, accessibility, and universal design topics that could benefit all.
So I would just say, just from our standpoint, again, there's very many different ways to structure this, but for an apprenticeship, what we're doing with Centura Health, which is the largest health employer in Colorado, with 21,000 employees, and they're also in Western Kansas. They're scaling our program corporate wide. So the idea is it's our platform, but all the Centura employees, who are in this program are given the login credentials. And fortunately, because we're the ones doing it, we have expertise in universal design. We make sure it's designed with that front. One of the grants that Mike was referencing, we leverage that specifically to invest in instructional design and universal design to make sure this is accessible for the population again we're serving. But I think I hear what you're saying is but if you're hosting the course at, whether it's University of Denver or any university or college, how can you get more people to log in? And I would say sometimes, your non-credit division may be able to do that because oftentimes our goal is to make it as easy as possible for a community member to take a course with us. So we typically have a little bit faster process. I bridge both credit and non-credit actually, but typically have a faster process for students to log into our courses. So that's one method. If you do have a non-credit or a professional continuing education division, they may be able to assist with that.
Yeah, and I think maybe just one quick step further on Brad's comments here. If I'm reading the question correctly, I like where you're going. Some sort of statewide marketplace where you could access these credentials, register for them, acquire them, whatever that looks like. Definitely a pipe dream of mine for quite some time. I think as close as we've gotten at this point, kind of in the badge space or the micro-credential space is on the learner side. So the learner can, of course, accumulate these badges and compile them into some sort of backpack portfolio, whatever that looks like. So we could have CU badges next to Arapahoe badges, next to DU badges. But I think that interface on the front end is one of the things that's still absent in this space. And frankly, some of the more promising projects I've seen in this have, you can talk with the architects, this is not my opinion, have failed drastically. So the University Learning Store is a really great example. So this was a collaboration of a bunch of land grant institutions in the Northern Midwest came together and said, we're gonna go head to head with the Coursera's and the edX, and they released a bunch of digital content with badges attached to them. Nobody registered. And so it fell apart. And so there's some really promising ideas out there. But I think that kind of user experience in that learning marketplace is one that we haven't necessarily seen at scale, but would love to crack the code on that one as well.
I'm really curious for you, Bianca, and then there is a question that we'll follow up with in chat specific to this. But as you think about, what you're hearing, even though you're just getting started, what do you, foresee? And sorry if this is putting you on the spot, but with an institution like DU being comfortable with, like, for example, that leadership credential being, not necessarily exclusive to DU. Do you foresee a future where there might be kind of external partnerships and mobility there?
Possibly, yeah. No, we've considered and will definitely partner with outside organizations. But I think outside of a lot of core skills, for example, a programming badge, so a lot of our badges, like the leadership badge, I think we're trying to make specific to certain objectives that DU was hoping to achieve. That makes sense. So
thanks for that. And there is this question specific to the portability. Somebody, so I think you just answered the question, are the ones at DU institutional specific? Sounds like they are. And then they ask about, are you partnering with an ed tech company to provide badges? And, I don't know if you need to feel an obligation to name that company if they're not a sponsor, but you maybe a yes or no, but how do students take these badges to employers?
yeah, no, I don't mind mentioning them. So we are partnering with Credentialing. So that's where all of our badges will be housed. And with the digital badges through Credentialing, students can share those through a numerous amount of ways. So they can embed them in emails, they can share them on various media outlets. And I think it's important to note, and I can't speak for other platforms, But for at least the one we're using, the students own the badges. So, and DU owns the badges. So regardless if the student doesn't want to use Credly or gets a badge from a different institution, so the badge is owned by the student.
Thanks for that, Bianca. And we also had a question, and I hope I get this right, Doug, on the Doug's wondering what work's being done to create some minimal standards on badges and credentials. And I'm not sure if he's thinking on the technical side or on the practitioner side. So maybe we could give a short answer of yes on the technical side. There are organizations doing that, and hopefully your institution's members of those organizations. But what about on the implementation side? What is kind of happening with when it comes to standards and consistency, maybe not even cross institution, but just within our own institutions?
I can briefly kick us off here. And Doug, I did drop in, just in case you're curious, the kind of specifications around the technical functions of the badges that Noah was mentioning. As far as kind of standards that we had internally, I'll speak primarily for at CSU when I was there. So really wanted to make sure that we had a rigorous, comprehensive process behind any badge that they put their name on, right? And so much of the things that Bianca was talking about, down to the imagery, we had to have it approved by communications and things like that. So there was all of those sorts of standards. But part of our use case was how can we take non-credit to credit? So we had to prove with that non-credit learning experience that it was comparable to that of what you would experience in a credit-bearing course. And so for us, that was kind of the framework that we applied. I will also say that we did not, and I know Noah and I have had longer conversations on this, but I did have a philosophy that we were not going to issue any participation ribbons at our institution. And so we didn't do anything that was simply for showing up or for attending or seat time or things like that. There really had to be some true assessment attached to that to show that that learning occurred and that that learner has and possesses the knowledge that we were trying to assess against.
I can concur with Mike. Do you have the same stance on participation-based badges?
Yeah, and I would say for us, we're just for now focusing on ones that are tied to like an industry recognized credential or an industry standard that already exists. But oftentimes through a semester-based curriculum, it's hard to tie, a competency to that. So that's where the microbadging kind of comes into play with us. So it's kind of already validated. But to Mike's point, yes, no participation medals. So there's certain standards they have to meet and it's validated by industry and education. But one of the things we are moving towards is the soft skills, right? That's typically the area where employers are struggling with. And we know through research done by countries like Switzerland, where 65% of their population goes through apprentices. So it's almost like 11 out of the 12 core soft skill competencies are better learned in outside the classroom. And so how do you truly work then with, through a work-based learning experience with your industry partner on validating those soft skills? There's only so much you can do in a controlled environment. And so that's where I think that real critical collaboration comes into play, because there's not an industry recognized credential around soft skills for the most part. What does that look like? What does critical thinking look like in the context of healthcare, in the context of, there's some similarities, there's some differences, and then how do you practice that and how do you measure that?
And Michael does have a follow-up question that I'll let the panelists read and then respond to, but just as a space saver in between, when we think around this, probably necessary march towards some standardization around things like soft skills, Eric, especially when we think about like in the community college system where you all are and who the population is served and who has historically been underserved by the education system, are there any concerns about a rush towards what we might kind of consider standardization without representation? And if so, what do you think, practitioners can do about that?
I think it just quickly, and our stance was we already had standardization in terms of our processes, in terms of who gets into college, who doesn't, whether you're access oriented or not, and who's left behind. And so our goal in creating parallel pathways through apprenticeship was to serve students who needed to make a wage, but also get that post-secondary credential. Healthcare is a really good example. There are some colleges out there that market a degree in medical assisting for $30,000, and they don't tell you you're really going to make $16 an hour and you're going to pay a lot of debt. So our goal was no debt, earn while you learn, and then you get your post-secondary credential. So our goal through creating this process was to create more access. But I do understand what you're saying. You don't want a super standardized process where you're leaving the certain members out. But what we've seen is, so out of 100 apprentices that we've had just in the one program we've done, there's others we've done, 50% are students of color, 35% are student parents. Centura has an 88% one-year retention rate, and these apprentices are still with Centura Health. And our goal is then working on their next step with them. But at least when their first step, they took on no debt, and they were able to make somewhat of a wage as they're going through their first entry-level post-secondary credential. But again, we want that stackable into their next steps. And that's where our system is still underdeveloped, especially in the healthcare space. Mike knows as well. Oftentimes, you want to get a nursing degree, you typically have to step out of the workforce for 2 years and go full-time. A lot of traditional programs are geared towards that. So we're trying to unbundle that now and work on that iteration of what does a nursing apprenticeship mean? How can industry incorporate that? What are the competencies involved? So people can stay employed but still get those credentials. Our traditional systems just don't work as well that way.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to everybody in the audience who's asking questions. Please do keep them coming. Mike, we'll go to you, and then we might come back to you in a second, Eric, as well, for a little elaboration, although I think you kind of just answered this a little bit. But Michael asks a follow-up question is are you seeing, Mike Macklin, employer buy-in on the badges and micro-credentials? Will an industry agreed upon set of standards improve or increase this buy-in, or more simply, with multiple different types of credentialing being created, how do employers view micro-credentialing?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Michael. And frankly, I think it's one of those unfortunate, it depends, right? And so there are certain industries that seem to have adopted this, whether as an internal company or through internal professional development, that have really leaned into this space. Some of the big players, of course, IBM, they use their IBM badges to upskill, reskill, and kind of next skill their employees internally. Those are available on the open market too, if you wanted to enter into IBM. Salesforce is another great example, where I think the it depends shifts a little bit from yes, employer adopted to not so much, is kind of when that rubber hits the road and what is our role and what's the role of business. And I think that, Eric would probably agree, and probably Bianca and some of the work that you've done, we hear a lot from business of we need people that can do the skills. Here's our list of skills. If you can prove that they've got these, we'll hire them. One of the things that has not followed is how employers are actually hiring for these jobs. You do not often see a job description posted on LinkedIn or on Indeed that says, do you have this micro-credential as a prerequisite for application? What they put on there is a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, which often serves as that proxy for knowledge, skills, and abilities. And as long as that continues to sit as that top hiring kind of in or out, I think that that's going to drastically deter micro-credentials and digital badges and kind of their efficacy into the future. And so I think finding those organizations, finding those sectors that really have adopted that skills-based hiring is a really great place to start building badges into. Because those sectors that are unwilling to remove some of those more traditional hiring requirements are going to continue to have a missed signal with we're saying we want you to hire for skills, but we're still going to put something on as a proxy versus kind of some of these actual credentials representing skills.
And Eric, I can see you taking a drink, wetting your throat here for this one, because I think that, you know, in addition to very much answering the question of just on the employer side, who cares, and kind of coming up with a very compelling answer for that, on why they care. You also, you know, would you mind sharing some of the work that you all are doing to directly kind of address what Mike described of, you know, these job descriptions that use really imperfect proxies for skills?
Yeah, so we partnered with the Markle Foundation in Schofield, Colorado, to use a tool to essentially that pulls from all the various job descriptions in the job that you say you want to hire for and that you're having a hard time with. And you pull from, say, 10 or 15 different companies, you know, basically you get your labor market data, you kind of understand what the jobs are and where the big openings are, say, in a certain region. And then you pull from those, and then this tool through Skills Engine, it pulls from those competencies. And then what you do is it creates a competency profile. And then you work with them, sort of, whether it's a trade union or some key industry people. And then we ask them to blast it out to people who are actually doing that job, and then rate those competencies from the most important to now we don't really do that anymore in this job. And it's amazing how many job descriptions are not either accurate or they're outdated, and they're asking for something that they're not really even doing on the job. So that's helped us with our property management apprenticeship, our community association management apprenticeship. It's kind of it's an involved process, but it really helps you collaborate well with the industry partners. And then through that, it's helpful then to kind of create some stackable credentials within that new pathway. So property management, community association management is a good example. There's typically no bachelor's degrees in community association management or property management, but those are two of the fastest growing professions in the metro area. Once you're an area manager, you can make good money, but those entry level jobs have super high turnover, and they don't even know what they're looking for. They're just looking for a pulse and someone that's over 18 and are you somewhat friendly, and it's horrible turnover, and those companies want to change their culture. So how do they grow from within? So that's the process we took. Well, what are you actually asking for? And is there a career path? And then what kind of degrees do you really need to be a property manager? You don't need a bachelor's degree year one. And so that's how we kind of map that out with them. So that's a different process than most, I would say, education professionals take when they're developing curriculum. That helps. But again, there are some industries that are more excited about collaborating and sort of sharing the competencies within jobs. And I kind of mentioned the tech sector, good people, they kind of have their own really entrenched subcultures sometimes that make it difficult. Like the culture at AT&T cyber team, it's a lot different than the one at Lockheed per se. And they are not going to even look at a badge that was created that they didn't have some influence over, unless it's an industry recognized credential. So we'll get there eventually. That's that 5-year plan, right? But at least for now, you work with a coalition of the willing, people who clearly have pain points in hiring entry-level positions, and then you try to figure out what that career path is, and what should they know and be able to do along that path. And then it helps you then look at, okay, your existing curriculum, some of it's going to work, and some of it's like, maybe they don't need a bachelor's degree to get into property management. How do we develop those relationships?
Thank you so much for that. There's definitely been interest in the chat from attendees around just kind of on the technology. So what platforms are we using? Are you using stuff that's native? Are you bringing, external badging software in? Are you building your own? And, I'd be curious just to hear from each of the panelists on your thoughts about that, because I think that, to Bianca's point, like this space is still pretty young. And so anybody who's doing it is probably getting emails saying, hey, which one should we use? And I'm wondering, when you're getting those, which one should we use questions, how are you responding to those? And what is your counsel to other people who are in just those kind of early investigative stages? And Bianca, maybe we can start with you, since you've done it most recently.
Yeah. So honestly, it took us a while to find our badging partner. Contracts took a long time, but I don't know. Yeah. So Credly has been pretty good for us, and yeah, I don't have much more to say than that. So.
Eric, you mentioned using multiple.
Yeah, for sure, because the instructional design partner typically builds it in a Canvas type platform, but our contract at the Colorado Community College System is with D2L. But oftentimes you can build it in a sort of agnostic platform, and then you can build it into whatever platform you need. So we just franchised our apprenticeship program in Ohio, actually, and they use Blackboard. So we're transferring our course shell into Blackboard as we speak. And part of that time and effort is through one of those DOL grants that we're using. So, but the instructional design of these programs is everything. And in the healthcare space, again, you know, if you relied, some of the trade apprenticeship programs, traditional ones, you know, relied on an in-person model, and COVID really threw that for a loop where it was hard for them to kind of continue it. Whereas in healthcare, we built these online platforms, you know, pretty in a robust format. And so we continued through the pandemic. And many of these individuals were working on the front lines, thank goodness, because there was such a shortage. So I would say instructional design into these at least again apprenticeship programs with where there's badges and microcredentials. Again, I know there's various ways to do this. Is the pandemic has truly demonstrated how critical the design of this is.
No, I think maybe just a quick piece in here too. So when I received that question of kind of what platform to use, all of those sorts of kind of corresponding questions around it, I think one of the first responses that I often give people is this the last question you're asking? Because I think one of the things that's really critical in this space is there is so much work that needs to go into this before you start worrying about the tech to issue badges, to claim badges, and all of those things. The actual instructional design pieces that Eric was talking about, the internal to the campus and internal to the college or university that Bianca was talking about, so much of that should be ironed out before you start worrying about, you know, which badge platform is going to issue the badge and collect the badge. Functionally, many of them, if not all of them, have the same kind of operating functions behind them. But the program architecture is so much more critical than the actual issuing and receiving of a badge that I really do think it needs to be that last question asked.
And thanks to Alicia there for dropping that in on CSU. I didn't know if Mike was going to mention that they had actually built their own at one point, which I don't know if anybody would still recommend that now that there's probably 36 plus companies that's all they do. If you want to go and build your own and go head to head with that. But I think that's really valuable insight there to focus on your needs and match your needs to a platform and to really focus on the learning design, as Eric pointed out. And you know, just having been on projects where we've pivoted from one platform to the other, as Alicia kind of alluded to in the chat, you know, the nice thing about open badges, as long as they're open badges, is there is that portability piece there. It's not necessarily exactly what it should be yet, but it's getting there. And so it's not, it's a very easy decision to not stay made on, I guess. I did have one, well, we can do one. This is super in the weeds. We might just keep it brief on this one. Doug's question here. And then I'd like to kind of conclude, unless somebody else drops a pressing question in the chat, with a kind of lessons learned round robin. But Doug asks if anybody's using blockchain like what we're seeing at ASU and in CC credentialing.
So since you said to keep it quick, Noah, no, at this point, though, Doug, you're probably aware, and if you're not, there are some initiatives in Colorado that are looking pretty heavily at the comprehensive learner record as it's being written to the blockchain. So Learning Economies is a group here in Colorado through the C Lab that is doing some work in that space. But for us at this time, no work in that space directly.
I know Credly is not on a blockchain right now, at least. Eric, or is any of your stuff?
No, not yet.
Yeah, I think that I don't know how you all feel about it. I know when I hear that question, my first kind of wondering is what's the need? And as Doug probably knows, that the ASU stuff is very identity centric, and you're making a lot of sense. And to Mike's point, there's some work with Learning Economy that if you look up My Colorado Journey, CDHE is really leading the charge on that. That's one of the things that's happening here in Colorado. There's also some neat kind of learner wallet type things happening in North Dakota and I believe Michigan as well. So definitely encourage people to check that out. With our remaining time, I'd love to just kind of do a round robin, and we can definitely pick up questions if anybody else drops them in the chat for us, but just around just a kind of vulnerability time, just any lessons learned, however small they are, or even on up to colossal fails that any of the panelists are willing to share that, might help other people who are going to follow you down this road and, helping them avoid all the cuts, scrapes, and bruises.
Yeah, I'll go first. So speaking from Dee's experience of implementation, I think having a clear picture of what kind or classification of microcredentials you want to offer is invaluable when going through that process. Adding on to that, maybe also establishing a thorough microcredential proposal process for both faculty and staff. I know we've kind of briefly touched on this throughout this panel, but if you have a clear idea of what microcredentials you want to offer and a thorough proposal that covers all the questions you care about, I think that'll save you time in the long run.
And Bianca, have you, I love concrete stuff, and if you're comfortable sharing, like, do you mind sharing where that has already popped up for you?
Yeah. So I think for us, if we had a more clear picture of, like I said, what kind of credentials we wanted to offer, it would have saved us time. We were just going back and forth between several different departments and our administration trying to figure out, what qualifies as a microcredential, what doesn't. And same thing with the proposal process, just finding what exactly we needed to know in order to make these non-credit opportunities appear more like credit opportunities.
Let's go to Mike and then Eric, and if people remember new lessons that they want to jump back in on, feel free. We'll start with Mike.
I think Eric and I were playing mute roulette there. I saw him like reach down and I reached down. So I think lessons learned, I talked a little bit about it in kind of introduction, but I really do think that if diving into this space, there really is a need to resource appropriately, get that leadership buy-in. Both of the projects that I mentioned, were generally soft money projects, and the one at CCCS, which I'll speak to, it lagged as soon as that money went away. And so I think being really mindful of what you're taking on and kind of how you're going to implement that is a really critical function. I think the analogy I use in this space, though the metaphor is probably really ridiculous, so bear with me. But if you ever have gone to like a community swimming pool and you watch an adult get into a swimming pool versus a child. So an adult usually goes down the steps a couple feet at a time or get down that ladder. You look at a child enter the swimming pool, they jump right in. And so I would recommend to folks looking at this, as so far as possible, jump into this space and really lean into it, because I think that kind of staggered stair-stepped approach is where you see a lot of these projects fail across the country. And so really leaning in, getting that leadership buy-in and trying to resource that appropriately is a critical function.
Yeah, I was going to say, we work in a very risk-averse industry in education oftentimes, and I think there's a lot of grants out there now to help mitigate some of that risk. But sometimes the only way you're going to learn is just by doing this, right? And by building it sometimes it's going to fail and sometimes it's going to work out super well. Like ours has with Centura. Last year we launched with community association management and property management. It was a little tricky. A lot of it's because their internal cultures were still about turn and burn and just throwing people to the fire. I'm like, that's not what an apprenticeship is. So you could have the best structure in place, but it's a co-pilot endeavor when you're talking about, at least what we're talking about with work-based learning and apprenticeships. And I would say, but to Mike's point, you have to resource appropriately, right? So you may get some startup funding for a year or maybe 2 years, but you have to have a sustainable model financially to make sure that this can go beyond the grants that you're relying on. So that's something that we are working through, but we think we found it in some of our apprenticeships, and we're still working through others. And we're hoping that more employers will come on to give us the scale that we need.
And when you talk about resource appropriately, a lot of people go straight to things like funding resources, but there's also human capital that comes into play. And I think that probably is also something that the stuff in the flavor of the week graveyard has a lot of commonality from one headstone to the other. Can you share just a little bit about kind of on the human kind of capital of resourcing, what kind of lessons learned either you've experienced or observed that you might share with people, and maybe not just for allocations, but also just kind of seats at the table and when they have seats at the table?
I'll just say it's important to have your college or campus CEO buy-in. Sometimes these can be some ad hoc efforts that sound good from a committee standpoint, but your chief executive and at least your provost, at least in my realm, need to be on board with work-based, at least if it's work-based learning, or the idea of micro-credentialing and badging. And when tension rises, they need to be able to articulate to the campus community kind of what's going on, so the people on the ground aren't the bad guy, or that we're not the ones trying to like make people uncomfortable or get them out of their comfort zone, because sometimes I think that can happen. So I would say for sure, making sure that your at least the board or your chief executive or provost can articulate the why of why you're doing this. So then when they're providing campus speeches, this is embedded in there, and this is part of what we do now. And if they're hesitating, probably good to just work internally before you implement stuff.
Bianca, is somebody, do you mind sharing who, I don't know if at DU have you been launching exclusively out of the registrar's office, or have there been kind of other partners at the table that have been invited in to help with that?
Yeah, so the registrar's office is housing the badging platform and the micro-credentialing process, but it's our schools themselves that'll be issuing the badges. So we've had 2 schools participate, and 1 school in particular, which is our professional development school. So they haven't made final decisions or anything, but they've actually been very instrumental in helping with the market research needed to implement badges, as well as providing insights about what they as a department and other departments might be interested in.
And I guess one final piggyback to that, we'll close with you, Mike, on, all 3 of you are so great at speaking to this. And so when we think about who's at the table, how important is it that communications is involved, and what does that look like in your eyes, Mike?
Yeah, and this goes back to, at the very beginning when I was talking about some of the work that really got Colorado in the map in this space. And a lot of that was done in collaboration and not in competition, because I think that as each institution, as each college moves at this on their own, whether it be school districts, nonprofit organizations, without any consistency, we really put a lot of noise into the market. And if we're talking about business buy-in, if we're talking about partner buy-in, or even policy legislative buy-in, if there's not some sort of consistent unified message in this space, we're going to continue to dilute our own products to the point where it's only noise that people are hearing. So I really do think that there's an opportunity for collaboration. There really is enough space for all of us in here. This, to me, in my opinion, is still definitely a blue ocean market. where there's room for all of us. But I do think coming together as higher education to respond to the needs of these communities and our businesses is a really powerful message to send.
And I don't think there's a better message on which to end this panel. Bianca Kumar of DU, Mike Macklin from CCCS, and Eric Dunker from Arapahoe Community College. Thank you all so much for being with us. And I hope people do reach out to you and pick your beautiful brains. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Great job.